When our family moved on to the Isle of Man, just coming up for 11 years ago, we learned a new phrase, a phrase that will be very familiar to most people here, tréad à l'heure, and learned that translated into English, that means time enough. And somebody described it to me, just the kind of the feeling of what tréad à l'heure means, and somebody described it to me as like mañana, but without the sense of urgency. What do you do? What do you do when God seems to say tréad à l'heure, when God says time enough, but when his timing is not yours? And when you're longing for that healing that you've been praying for that salvation for a loved one that you've been praying for that job, for that financial provision, for that relationship to be sorted. What do you do with the bigger longings that we pray about in our prayers for peace in Ukraine and for the global warming that just seems to continue to get worse without always the political will to deal with things? And sometimes, whether it's things in our own life or things in our world, there are times when tréad à l'heure just feels frustrating or maybe even negligent. And we can identify with these prayers that you see peppered throughout Scripture that go something like, Lord, please, now. Jesus has been on the other side of the lake in Gentile territory and has wonderfully brought a man out from demonic oppression and has set him free. And now, back on the Jewish side of the lake, the crowds are gathering around him, and all their demands and all of their urgency is pressing in upon him. And most urgent of all is this man, Jairus, who comes to him and he says, my daughter is close to death. The Greek literally says she is holding at the end. Just a picture of holding on to life by the fingertips, but the fingertips are slipping away. Jairus was a synagogue leader, kind of the chief operating officer of the synagogue. He would be a wealthy man, a man of means, because the synagogue leader usually funded that post and funded much of the work of the synagogue out of his own funds. Under normal circumstances, someone in his position you would expect to be nervous of Jesus, this radical rabbi who incited such different reactions and responses. But this was not normal circumstances, and all that matters here for Jairus is that he is a dad and his girl is dying. And so he comes to Jesus and he falls at his feet and he pleads, please come and lay your hand on my daughter and she'll get well. He'd obviously seen some of these things that Jesus could do and had faith enough to know that if Jesus turns up and places hands on his sick daughter, that she will get well. Jairus needs that power that he's seen of Jesus healing people and forgiving people of sin and casting out these demons. This is not a tréad à l'heure moment. This would be a good time for Mark's favorite word throughout his gospel, immediately. You know, Jairus comes to Jesus and Jesus goes immediately, lays hands on the girl and she gets well. And the scene shifts, and this is where we get the burger. That Jairus and his daughter are kind of the bun, and in the middle is this other story. The crowd are pressing around Jesus, and this woman comes as an interruption to this important mission to save the life of Jairus' daughter. I say interruption. I so admire the fact that when I read the Gospels, no one is ever an interruption to Jesus. And I aspire to have that focus. So easy to be running around in our urgency and not to see the person and the need in front of us. For Jesus, you are always the focus in front of him, and your need is not something off to the side of something more urgent. This interruption from the woman is not an in-your-face kind of interruption. It's very low profile, and we realize why. When we discover that she's been bleeding for 12 years. I've just finished reading through Leviticus, and there's a whole chapter of Leviticus that deals with what to do with bleeding. And a woman in her situation where she was consistently bleeding, she would be unable to have other social contact. In fact, if somebody came near to her and was in danger of touching her, she had a responsibility to shout out, "Unclean!" And this woman wouldn't have had a hug for 12 years. And Mark tells us that she suffered under many doctors. Dr. Luke, in his version, doesn't tell us that she suffered under many doctors, but she did, and she got worse. And there's something about, there's a verse in Proverbs that says, "Hope deferred makes the heart grow sick." And people say, "Trade allure," but time and again and again and again, this woman had put her hope into the next treatment, into the next thing that might actually do the job. And time and again, her hopes were crushed. And she was drained. She was probably drained of blood from her cheeks because she may well have been anemic. But she was also drained of every penny from her account. She'd spent everything she had trying to find cures, and now she was left sick and penniless and an outcast. And in the midst of this melee of the crowd, as Jairus is trying to act like a human snowplow to push his way through, to get Jesus through to his daughter, this woman just sneaked up, touched the hem, the edge of Jesus' cloak. And there's Mark's word now. It says immediately her bleeding stopped, and she knew in her body that she was well. Immediately the flow of blood stopped, and the blood returns to properly to her body, and whatever was the issue, the infection, the obstruction, it was just gone. And there was another immediately. He says, at once, Jesus knew. And he said, somebody touched me. Power has gone out from me. Little foreshadow. Mark gives little foreshadows all the way through of the cross. Somebody reached out and touched me, and power has gone out from me. And on the cross, power would go out from Jesus, and his blood would be drained out for our healing, for our salvation, for our wholeness. And Jesus stopped and he said, somebody's touched me. Who touched me? And the disciples are going, really, dude? I mean, look around. And it reminds me a little bit of a time when I was in primary school, and with a friend, I was somewhere out of bounds that I shouldn't have been. I think it was the staff car park. And a teacher came round the corner, and we jumped off the wall we were sitting on. We scarpered, thought we'd got away with it. And then this teacher, about an hour later, appears in my classroom, and she stands up the front and says, somebody in this classroom was somewhere they shouldn't have been, and I want that person to stand up. And I knew that she knew that I knew that she, and I was busted. And I kind of picture this woman feeling like this, but only so many times worse. Because she'd sneaked up to Jesus and she'd kind of surreptitiously got this healing. And she'd done something that the law forbade her to do. She was an unclean woman touching this rabbi, making him unclean. What would Jesus do? What would he say? Would he tell her off? Would he take back the healing that she'd just received? And so she comes in fear and trembling and fesses up to Jesus. One thing I know is that if you're in a hurry to get somewhere and you meet someone who has had years of complex condition, you don't say to them, "Tell me about your illness." And at this moment, Jairus is probably feeling sick in the pit of his stomach. But Jesus takes the time, and the woman tells her story, and then he says this beautiful thing: "Your faith has healed you." She maybe had a slightly superstitious idea of what was going on up until that point, and Jesus was saying, "Hey, I don't have magic clothes. It's not faith in the universe. Your faith in me, your faith in Jesus has healed you." And he calls her daughter. 12 long years she'd waited. Do you know, when we wait and we don't get the answers that we want from Jesus, when we want, it's because he wants to do so much more than we can yet see or imagine. And when he says your faith has healed you, the word for healed, the word is sozo, and it means healing, it means salvation, it means wholeness. And he's saying you've found faith in me, you've found your salvation, you've found your wholeness, you've found your everything in me. You came for a touch and you've got so much more. And he dignified her and he called her daughter and he restored her to her place. And in his timing, Jesus wants to give us so much more than we ask for. That's what we're reminded on up on the wall there. He's able to do immeasurably more than we ask or imagine, according to his power. And so you got this burger, and we've had the woman in the middle, and we're coming back to Jairus. And Jairus' worst fears are confirmed as he sees some familiar faces coming towards him. And it can only mean one thing. And he says, "Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" What do you do? What do you do when Jesus' time doesn't look like time enough? And I wonder if Jairus and maybe the disciples and maybe some people in the crowds around at that moment were saying, "Jesus, you've blown it. You've been negligent." If you were in this room on yesterday morning, you'd have seen a number of dummies lying around on the floor because a group of us were doing first aid training. We're all just kind of at our peak of knowledge. So if anybody needs CPR, this would be a good morning. Just saying. But one of the things that was mentioned in a few times in the first aid training was the importance of triaging. The importance of prioritizing what is medically the first thing to do, the most important thing to do, and then what takes second and third priority underneath that. So imagine an ambulance picks up a 12-year-old girl and she's close to death. And they're blue lighting her down to Nobles, and the ambulance driver stops because he sees a woman sitting on a wall, and he's known the woman for a while, and he knows that she has a chronic condition, and he sits down to talk with her about her chronic condition and to help her, and then gets back into the ambulance, and the little girl is dead. That would be the most serious of malpractice. Jesus, what do you think you're doing? Dealing with this chronic condition when there's this acute condition, this girl who's about to die, and you're there schmoozing the crowd. That's malpractice, Jesus. But Jesus' timing is rarely ours. How we would love Jesus' timing to be our timing, but Jesus' timing is rarely ours. And he looks Jairus in the eye at this most vulnerable of moments, and he says, don't be afraid, just believe. And this is Jesus' call to all of us in whatever we face. Don't be afraid, just believe. We're not to trust just for the things that we think that we can trust Jesus with, and not even just the difficult things, but trust Jesus with the catastrophes, with the things that make no sense, with the things to which you don't have the answers, because Jesus has them in his hands and his time. Jesus takes with him just his inner circle, Peter, James, and John, the same people who will be with him on the Mount of Transfiguration, the same three who will be with him at Gethsemane. And as he arrives, he's left one crowd behind, and there's a different crowd in front of him. This is a crowd of mourners and wailers. And the rabbis required that even a peasant, if somebody died in their family, that they should at least hire 2 flute players. So you could have a good side hustle, Rosalind. You'd have to hire at least 2 flute players and 1 female wailer. That was for a very poor family. Jairus was a wealthy man, a man of position, and so there would be quite a crowd of people who were hired for this purpose of expressing the family's laments. And into this, Jesus comes and says, why are you weeping and wailing? The child's not dead, she's just sleeping. And the professional wailers quickly become amateur laughers as they ridicule Jesus and say, this isn't our first gig. We know when a girl is dead. And this girl's dead. And Jesus and his 3 disciples and mum and dad go into the room. And in the only place where Mark tells us the Aramaic words spoken, and he does it to show us the intimacy of what's going on, he reaches out and holds the little girl's hand. Second time in this afternoon that he's become ritually unclean as he touches a corpse. And he says to her, Talitha, cum. And it means, little girl, get up. Talitha means little girl, but it's hard to kind of get the feeling of the translation of that. It's a very familial word. It's like sweetheart or darling or honey. And it's a bit like what a mum would say when she goes into her little girl in the morning and says, honey, it's time to get up. And Jesus shows himself to be Lord over death and over time No magic words, no incantation, just reaching out and taking her hand. Honey, time to get up. 12 years ago, something momentous happened in two families. In one family, a daughter was born. In another family, a daughter started to bleed. And on this day, both daughters were restored. And Jesus says, get her a sandwich. In our first aid training yesterday, one of the things that was said was, if you've got somebody who is a bystander and they look like they might be heading into shock, give them something to do. Mum and Dad, go and make a sandwich. And the one who orders the weather and casts out the demons and heals the sick cares for a little girl's hunger. And you know, one thing that we see time and again when we look at the Gospels is that the power of Jesus is kind and tender. Kind and tender to the woman who had been suffering for 12 years. Kind and tender to this little girl and her family. The power of Jesus is kind and tender to you. And see in this gospel picture what Jesus is like. What Jesus is like for you. So Mark gives us this burger story, another story in the middle. And it was a common Jewish literary device. And so the Jewish readers of Mark would know to pay attention to what was in the middle of the burger. And they would realize that there was something important here about Jesus' timing. And they would see, too, that this woman is to be an example to Jairus as she reaches out in faith. And Jesus says, your faith has healed you. Faith is powerful. And he says to Jairus, effectively, this is an example to you. Don't be afraid, only believe. Now, we read this story and of course, we don't read it with the same sense of tension that the original readers do, because we know the story. If you've read the Gospel of Mark, you know how the story ends. But you don't know how your story and the story of your loved ones ends. The reality is that we are all in the middle of our stories. And Jesus knows the end, but we don't. There's an old African-American spiritual song that says, God may not come when you call him, but he'll be there right on time. God may not come when you call him, but he'll be there right on time. Ask Elijah when at the times when he wanted to die as much as at the times when the fire and the glory fell. Ask Martha and Mary in their darkest times, Lord, if you had been there, our brother would not have died. Ask the saints of Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11 is this incredible roll call of faith and people who had wonderful answers to prayer by faith. And then this. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawn in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. You can ask the saints in Revelation 10, as we read about the people of God waiting under the altar and crying, "How long, O Lord? How long till we see justice? How long till you give us what we long for?" And you can ask the saints here, so many saints here, for whom loved ones have died suddenly or suffer painfully. So many for whom there are long and weary burdens to carry. We are in the middle of our stories. And as Paul reminds us, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has conceived what God has prepared for those who love him. And so Jesus says to you, as he says to the woman, your faith has healed you. Your faith has saved you. Go in peace. And our faith is in the Jesus who we meet here, who is tender and merciful and loving and powerful. Our faith is in the Jesus who stretches out his arms on the cross and takes our sickness, our suffering, our pain, our alienation from God, our shame, our separation, everything, so that we can live in wholeness, in shalom, in freedom. Jesus says to you the same as he says to Jairus, don't be afraid. Just believe. God may not come when you call, but he'll be there right on time. Let's pray.